podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and the Pavilion with Stephen Wallace. In each show, Stephen will interview someone connected to the world of horse racing or cricket.
Hello everyone, joining us today we have Chris Garibaldi, the former director of the National Horse Racing Museum at Palace House, Newmarket, to talk about the day Queen Elizabeth II came to Newmarket to officially open the new museum in November 2016. Thanks for joining me, Chris.
Pleasure.
I've got to start, Chris, by asking you, what does Thursday, the 3rd of November, mean to you?
Well, at the risk of sounding slightly corny, it's sort of engraved on my heart. I mean, it was the most incredible day, the result of so much sort of planning and forethought and care. And then we woke up, apart from anything else, you're always worried about the weather in these situations. We woke up to the most beautiful, glorious, sunny day. And it was just a magical experience for everybody who'd been involved in the project, but particularly special for I was in the very, very privileged position of spending the whole hour and a bit that the Queen spent at the museum with her, walking her around with Peter Jensen, the chairman of the trustees. And it was an extraordinary day.
Well, thanks for that. I'd like to start by talking about the planning for the day. You were appointed the director of the National Horse Racing Museum in 2010, when the museum was on the High Street in Newmarket. But how soon did you start on the museum's move to the new site in Palace Street in Newmarket?
Well, absolutely immediately, because in fact, some of the plans to move the museum to its new site were largely in place. That decision had been made. So I was specifically employed to help make that happen, because I'd had experience of a large capital redevelopment at Norwich Castle Museum when I was Keeper of Decorative Arts up there a few years earlier. And the trustees were looking for someone who had both museum and curatorial experience, and at the same time had been involved in a large capital redevelopment. And funnily enough, as a result, I came to the job actually with very little knowledge or experience of horse racing. And it was a bit of a steep learning curve when I had to marshal an awful lot of information very, very quickly about horse racing. But I think I got there. I mean, some people probably think I haven't, but I made the best stab I could of it.
You were moving to an historic racing yard at Palace House Stables, which were last used in the 1985 season by Bruce Hobbs. It must have been a very big project, both financially and structurally.
Yes, I mean, it was huge. I mean, the stable complex was absolutely magical for a number of reasons. Firstly, it had been derelict for a number of years. Very sadly, the trainer's house had been subject to arson, and had been burnt out. And so the site was protected and closed off. But essentially, it was and is 5 acres right in the heart of Newmarket, which included the last remaining element of Charles II's racing palace in the town. When one went in at that stage, I mean, one walked into a ruin in the case of the trainer's house and the stables, but it was incredibly evocative, absolutely magical. And it was an extraordinary privilege, actually, to be part of a project that brought that back to life. And most importantly, perhaps because of Newmarket being the centre of horse racing nationally and internationally, was to put racehorses back in one of the yards. So to combine with the retraining of racehorses charity, to have live horses as part of the visitor experience, because that's what people want to see. They want to meet a horse. I mean, that was true of Her Majesty the Queen as well.
And as the Queen was the patron of the museum, she actually opened the old museum in 1983. Was she always the person you wanted to open the new museum?
Oh, yes, absolutely. As you say, she had opened the original museum almost sort of 30 years earlier, and everybody knows her profound personal interest in horse racing and her connections with Newmarket. So also, obviously, as the patron of the museum, she was the obvious person to ask, and we had our sort of fingers firmly crossed. But of course, with any large redevelopment project, there are inevitably delays, and there are issues and timetabling challenges. So you never know until fairly late in the day whether that is going to be possible, because of course all the senior members of the royal family, their diaries get incredibly full. So again, this is why it's so important to liaise at such an early stage with the Lord Lieutenant's office, who sort of manage all the calls from the county on the royal family's time, and can sometimes, as they did in fact with our visit, coordinate it with other visits. It works very much more efficiently if the member of the royal family, whoever they are, can combine one visit in an area with a number of other things. And so with us, the Queen unveiled the statue of herself at the top of Newmarket High Street, and then came down to the National Horse Racing Museum and opened our new site. But there were a number of engagements in the area.
And it must be an understatement to say that you had a lot of meetings with councils, schools and other organisations planning the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, none of these visits is a sort of spur of the moment phenomenon, and particularly with the head of state, you have a whole sort of extra level of coordination to be involved. And as I say, it was then decided that this would be the visit day that Her Majesty the Queen, in a sense, came to Suffolk in her birthday year. So immediately a whole lot of additional protocols sort of clicked into place. So when she came to the museum, there was a whole very sort of formal level of introductions. So it was people like the High Sheriff, I think it was the Bishop, it was the MP, it was a whole sort of hierarchy of people who were formally presented. And what was also rather fun was we were able to then invite all the mayors from Suffolk and their spouses. So when the Queen came into the first courtyard at the back of the building, which is the Rothschild yard, where the training racehorses are, she was immediately confronted with practically every mayor and their partner from Suffolk, which was rather fun. But the reality is that you want to open the event to as many people as possible. But inevitably what happens is a really quite difficult balance between that and at the same time keeping it under control. I mean, I think we ended up in the end with about 300 to 400 invited guests. Now, that's quite apart from the people that then stood in the sort of public areas. But luckily, because of the 5-acre site, we were able to accommodate that really very comfortably, although a lot of it had to be outside, which is why I was so nervous about the weather. I mean, it was November after all, so many a thing could have gone wrong. And in fact, we issued some very strict, I was very bossy in the letters that went out to the invitees that said, this will mostly be outside. There will be very little inside. Please dress warmly. Please bring an umbrella. And if it rains, you will get wet. Simple as that. But I think one of the things that we felt very strongly, though, was that we wanted to open it up to as many people as we physically could to celebrate this momentous occasion of the Queen coming to the museum. But also, what you have to be slightly sensitive to is the fact of how many people can then be actually formally presented to the Queen. Because it sounds silly, but that requires the Queen to shake hands. And she was 90 at the time, although very physically robust for a 90-year-old. But at the same time, if you think of someone having to physically shake hands with, we couldn't have had her shaking hands with 300 people. So we had to be very selective about that. And that involves some quite difficult discussions because obviously everybody, wants to meet the Queen. It might be their only moment of meeting her in their life. And then you have the discussion about, yes, is it partners, is it spouses, is it family? So some of those discussions went on for some time, let's put it that way. But we tried to be as open and at the same time as fair and balanced as possible, because also you don't want just the fundraisers to meet the Queen. You want people all across the organisation.
And as you said earlier, the Queen had officially opened the statue of her with the mare and foal at the top of the High Street. She then came to the National Horse Racing Museum. How did her day go from there when she arrived?
Right. Well, as you say, she unveiled the statue and then came in sort of almost formal procession, in a sense, in the big car down Newmarket High Street, which was absolutely crammed. You couldn't have got another person in there, and flag waving, and it was absolutely fantastic. And then drove round to the back of the site, where our coach park is, or was, in my case, and which was where we could accommodate the cars and the sort of main introductions to people. I mean, what was really charming, we worked quite closely with All Saints Primary School, whose site backed onto ours, and I was very, very keen that the pupils of All Saints School should be involved. And in fact, we got a couple of classes of theirs to actually come up right to where the Queen got out of her car. And it was absolutely sweet. They can't have been more than sort of 5 or 6 year olds, and they all sang the national anthem. And we were placed around the corner waiting for the Queen to come in, and all we could hear was the All Saints primary school children singing. It was just the sweetest thing you've ever heard. It was absolutely gorgeous. One of my abiding memories of the day. And then the Queen came round, was introduced. So to begin with, she was introduced to people by the Lord Lieutenant of Suffolk, who was, or is Claire, Countess of Euston, who is absolutely lovely and was so helpful in us organising the day. And then she, in a sense, gave the Queen over to Peter Jensen, the chairman of the trustees, and I was introduced, and then Peter and I escorted the Queen around the site. And the first thing was in the Rothschild yard, we introduced her to one of her ex-racehorses, Barbers Shop. And she was absolutely delighted. I mean, I'm sure she makes an effort to look interested in anything she opens, but you just knew with the racehorses, she was absolutely on sort of home turf and loved every minute of it. And funnily enough, it was the only moment in the day when I saw her team from the private secretary's office look a little bit worried when she was being introduced to the to Barbers Shop, because I just could read their minds. It's, oh Lord, I hope we don't lose the schedule, because she was absolutely enchanted and she fed Barbers Shop carrots and no, it was really, really charming.
Yeah, because Barbers Shop, for listeners, was seventh in the Cheltenham Gold Cup in 2009.
Yeah, and is a classic example of how thoroughbreds can be retrained for a life beyond racing, and that's what the ROR, the Retraining Racehorses Yard, is all about. Is showing that there is a life beyond racing, and how very effectively racehorses can be retrained for polo and eventing and hacking. This sort of the cliche of the flighty thoroughbred that can't ever be calmed down is absolute nonsense. If retrained correctly, as the ROR have developed a very, very effective system of doing, they can make very good horses for other purposes.
You mentioned the Rothschild yard, and I thought I'd bring a bit of history in here, because the Rothschilds were the people who purchased or bought the stables off the Crown.
Yes, in the mid-19th century. I mean, the Crown was disposing of, or trying to dispose of, the palace from about 1819, but it rumbled on for a number of years. I don't think there was agreement about whether they were going to get rid of it. Eventually, the site was properly, if you like, sold off in the late 1850s, and a few years later was purchased by a member of the Rothschild family, and then became the Rothschild racing base in Newmarket throughout the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. And in fact, it was Leopold Rothschild who built a new yard onto the back of the site in 1903, which probably doubled the number of horse boxes. And of course, he was very much in the racing set with Edward VII at that time, who was racing out of, or training out of Edgerton House, or having his horses trained out of Edgerton House at the other end of Newmarket. And in fact, actually, in a sense, I suspect that's why the final portion of Charles II's racing palace over the road actually survived. It's because it was redeveloped by the Rothschild family as their house. And so, whereas the rest of the palace was pulled down, it survived into the 20th century. And that's what Palace House now has been returned to its form as it was sort of at the end of its first incarnation as a royal palace.
And from the Rothschild yard, the Queen then moved into the King's Yard, because I know she went into the simulator room to see one of my friends, Frank Conlon, where also Pat Cosgrave was on the simulator.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it was very funny because Frank was a bit naughty. I mean, the Queen was very, very relaxed, and he offered her a go on the simulator, and she roared with laughter and said, "No, perhaps not this time." But again, all through the two yards, there were guests standing in the sunshine. I mean, it was wonderful. There was sort of clapping, and we had a prescribed route that we were taking, and showed her some of the galleries on the ground floor of the King's Yard. And then that's where the formal unveiling, if you like, of the sort of dedicatory commemorative plaque took place. That's not where it now is. It was then recited into the main atrium, but the right next to actually the shop and the ticket desk. But there wasn't the space there. So because, again, as I say, we wanted as many people as possible to take part, we had the unveiling in the King's Yard where we could get the maximum number of people.
And the Queen also went into the shop because I think she was presented with a Newmarket Monopoly set.
Yes, no, absolutely. So we then walked her through the cafe where a lot of the museum volunteers were actually assembled, and that was lovely because, of course, the volunteers were the absolute sort of core of being able to run the museum, particularly on the new site where we were sort of covering five acres. And then we showed her the new shop. And it's funny, you talk about the sort of pre-planning. We had obviously a number of visits from the private secretary's office and walked them around the site as well. And we said, do you think the Queen, Her Majesty would like to see the shop? And they said, oh, yes, I think so. I mean, you can just show it to her. And then we said, well, again, should we, would she like to be presented with something? And they sort of said, well, yeah, can, whatever. And so we thought what would be lovely would be just to say, Your Majesty, would you consider accepting the gift of a set of Newmarket Monopoly, which was the special commemorative edition that had been made. And instead of hotels on sort of odd properties, it was trainers' yards and things, and all the trainers in Newmarket were. It's a wonderful, wonderful version. And I don't know whether, one thought she might just politely say yes or politely decline and say, no, thank you very much. And she was very keen. She said, oh, yes, I think the grandchildren would love that. And that was a lovely moment because obviously it's the Queen, as our head of state at the time. And at the same time, you felt the real person was coming out at that point. So that was charming as well.
Well, let's hope they've been playing it at Buckingham Palace.
It was quite funny. I think at the end of that year, they published a list of all the presents that she'd been given during her 90th birthday year. And I think because of the sort of interest in horse racing, I think we topped the list, or were one of the sort of top 10 that was mentioned, because I think it captured people's imagination.
But you then moved across to Palace House, which is the home of British sporting art. And again, just picking up on the history, you've mentioned a bit of this before, but this is the third Royal Palace site in Newmarket.
Yeah. Yes, the first sort of what's always been described as a hunting lodge was built for James I in 1609. And that's slightly on a site slightly further down the high street. In fact, it was a fairly shoddy building, we think, because in 1613, it actually fell down around the king's ears. There's a wonderful account of him being dragged out in the middle of the night as the lintels broke and the windows exploded outwards, because I think it was basically a bad case of substance. But whether there's a bit of exaggeration in the telling. But anyway, to cut a long story short, from 1613 to 1625, quite a large amount of money was poured into building a sort of second palace on that same site. But that then mostly was pulled down in the 1650s under the parliamentary regime, under Cromwell. And then when Charles II re-establishes Newmarket as a base for racing in the 1660s, having been restored to the throne, he chooses to build what you might describe as the third royal palace on a slightly different site further up the high street. And it's a small portion, the King's Lodgings of that palace, that was built between 1668 and 1671, that has survived in the form of Palace House. So, and that's, yes, as you say, that's the home for the British Sporting Art Trust's collections. And wonderfully, a number of paintings, sporting art paintings, were presented to the Tate in London through the auspices of the British Sporting Art Trust, and now, in a sense, have an appropriate permanent home with the Palace House in Newmarket. It's the obvious place for if you like, the national collection of British sporting art. I mean, Newmarket is a town that's got racing in its DNA. The reason that racing developed in Newmarket was it emerges out of a court culture, a private challenge amongst members of the court riding out against each other. So it's the perfect combination of the National Horse Racing Museum and what I've always regarded as the national holding of British sporting art.
And you've got some fabulous paintings in there. Fabulous paintings in
yes, I mean, the has to be said, it's a mixture of the British Sporting Art Trust's own collections, which are fantastic, and very generous loans from the Tate in London, and indeed a number of loans from private collections. And so it's brought together a really representative collection of British sporting art. And in fact, actually, there's a wonderful loan from the Victoria and Albert Museum of a folded painted screen, and each panel is a different sport. And that was one of the primary objects that we showed to the Queen when she came on her visit, as we showed her around the collections.
Presumably the Queen was very impressed with the paintings in Palace House.
Oh, absolutely, and very interested in the detail. I mean, I think there's often a sort of cliche that the Queen was interested in racing and not much else. And it's just so untrue. I mean, she had a very, very inquisitive mind and almost encyclopedic knowledge, because she'd been exposed to so many subjects and was absolutely fascinated by the paintings. And I think what makes British sporting art so interesting is the social history that you see in the works. And she was fascinated at some of the details that we were pointing out. In fact, one of the funny things from a personal point of view, in terms of going up to the collections, which are predominantly on the first floor in Palace House in Newmarket, was that the Queen, unfortunately, at that point, was beginning to suffer slight mobility issues. And so the answer was obviously to take her up in the lift. But I had this awful kind of panic that I might go down in history as the person who had got the Queen stuck in a lift. And so one of the precautions we had gone to was to ask for a lift engineer to be on site, just in case, if God forbid the worst had happened, we had someone immediately to sort the situation out. And the poor chap hadn't been told ahead of time that this was why we were asking for him. So he arrived thinking he was just coming to do a normal sort of inspection of the lift. And I had to say, no, that was done last week. We think we're fine, but explain the situation. And he was hidden under the staircase just next to the lift, so that if anything had gone wrong, he could leap out immediately and sort the situation out. But thankfully, nothing occurred. But the lift was nevertheless quite small, and so it could only accommodate two people, the Queen and the Lord Lieutenant, the Countess of Euston. And so myself and the chairman of the trustees had to put the Queen into the lift and then run up the stairs and meet her at the doors when she came out. It must, I suspect, from her point of view, look very, very funny, as we were trying not to look as if we just run up the stairs behind her.
You must have been pleased when the door opened.
She didn't get stuck in the lift, so that was a phew moment.
Yeah, you must have been pleased when the door opened of the lift.
Yes, absolutely. I hasten to add, nothing had ever gone wrong with it before, so I wasn't sort of risking Her Majesty the Queen in a perilous situation. But you just have that awful moment where you think, what happens if it, what would we do if it did go wrong? And at that point, I thought, no, we're having an engineer on site.
And touching on history, you mentioned him earlier, Edward VII, the Queen's great-grandfather. He used to stay at Palace House because he was friends with the Rothschild family. Well,
yes. In fact, he didn't stay there for, as far as I know. He used to stay in the Jockey Club rooms, just up the high street. But he often used to dine with the Rothschilds, and so he would go to Palace House. And in fact, there was quite a nice story about that, in that the police got rather fed up with having to police quite large crowds. And I think, in fact, Edward VII himself, he regarded this as a sort of a private visit. And I think everybody got a bit fed up with everybody sort of pitching up. And so a couple of times the police let it slip that the king was going to dine with the Rothschilds. And in fact, then he didn't. And so people then got bored with turning up and waiting for when he wasn't going to turn up. And so it dealt with the crowds. And then from that point on, I think he was able to go sort of fairly regularly without a great hullabaloo. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is there's a difference between sort of, the private life of the royal family and their public persona. And that's why what was such a privilege was to have the Queen coming in her formal role, and the visit to Newmarket being the thing that she did in her 90th birthday year for the county. So we were very lucky to be chosen.
I've got to ask you, but were you nervous?
Yes, I mean, I think anyone that says they're not nervous when meeting the Queen or a senior member of the royal family, but particularly the monarch, I think is telling you a fib. Of course I was nervous. I mean, apart from anything else, it's not just, I mean, they always spend, huge effort to make one feel at ease. And as I said, once I was walking the Queen around the site, I have to say, yes, I got into the rhythm of it and wasn't, I think, sort of nervous at the time. But in the lead up to it, you are. And as I say, there's always a sort of voice at the back of your head sort of thinking, what possibly could go wrong? But it's a very well-practiced routine. I mean, what you've always got to remember is this is, maybe the one and only time you do it. But for them and the system and the private secretary's office, they have seen this. This is what they do. This is their job. And it's a very smooth operation. But I'd been lucky enough. I had the privilege of meeting the Queen on a number of occasions before this. But even then, one feels, you can't pretend not to be nervous.
And how did you feel at the end of the day?
Oh, ecstatic. I mean, a huge relief in a sense once it's over. But I mean, it's absolutely magical. And I think what's lovely is that they have a system of pooling photographers. So there's an official photographer who accompanies you around the site. And so even though actually I was with the Queen for over an hour, it goes past in an absolute flash. So what's always been lovely is to see some of the photographs. And of course, you see things in the photographs that you didn't see at the time. I mean, one thing I slightly regret is, although it was a beautiful day, it was quite cold. And I put a jumper on under my suit jacket in the run-up as we were getting the site ready, because we all had to be on site from really quite early in the morning. And I'd forgotten to take it off before the Queen arrived. So I look a little less than slick because I'm wearing a sort of woolly jumper under my suit. But at the same time, I think I probably got away with it.
And have recent events following the Queen's death on the 8th of September brought the day back to you recently?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was extraordinary to realize one had witnessed, a tiny moment in history, and to be able to say that I'd been part of a project that had manifested itself in the Queen coming to open the new museum, and being part of that sort of wider celebration for Newmarket and for the county. And it was very, very touching. I mean, I was lucky enough after the visit to be invited to a garden party at Buckingham Palace to represent the museum there. I think it's sort of not exactly a thank you, but it's a sort of acknowledgement of what happened, and that was charming. And I wasn't presented to the Queen on that occasion, but I thought that was fair dues because it's probably other people's opportunity. But then I did actually go down myself to witness the lying in state. I was going down to London anyway on the Wednesday when it first started in Westminster Hall. Now, I toyed with the report that there might be sort of 12, 20-hour queues. So I thought, well, I'll pop down to see what the queue is like. And at that point, they were saying it might be about 5 hours. And it was a beautiful evening. So I queued with everybody along the Thames. So it was absolutely charming. And we were sort of chatting to people. In fact, it ended up being an 8-hour queue. But that was extraordinary because I actually ended up going through Westminster Hall at about 1 o'clock in the morning with an utterly magical feel to the place. London was utterly, quiet, extraordinarily atmospheric. And whilst there was sort of good humour and chat in the queue leading up to it, the moment anybody got close to the hall, a completely different atmosphere sort of settled on the place. And it was a profoundly moving experience. And I felt, although I'm no longer at the museum, that I was sort of half representing the museum on that occasion. And it was a profoundly moving scene. And I was extremely lucky, again, fortunate. Just as I entered Westminster Hall at the top of the steps, facing Her Majesty's coffin, they sort of banged the floor, and there was one of the changing of the guard, and so they stopped the line. And so for about 5 minutes, I stood at the top of the steps with this extraordinary scene in front of me, sort of uninterrupted view of what was going on. And it was really a sort of spine jingling moment. I mean, you sort of feel the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. And I was really touched. It was extraordinarily touching to see how moved people were. And my abiding memory is not merely standing and watching the changing of the guard, but when I had passed the coffin and was leaving, there was no hurry. I mean, some of the news reports gave the impression that one queued for hours and then had a couple of seconds in there. Not at all. I mean, everybody just walked at a very steady pace. But once you passed the coffin, nobody rushed you out. You could take as much time as you wanted. And I just stood looking back at Westminster Hall in a way that one, I think, is unlikely to ever see it again. It was, and well, let's say, hopefully not for a long time. And it was a profoundly moving experience. I'm very, very glad I did it. And there's no doubt that all the time I was doing it, the memories of the day in Newmarket were coming back to me.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. I went to see the flowers in Green Park, and talking about flowers, we also had so many flowers laid at the sculpture of the Queen with the mare and foal in Newmarket.
No, absolutely. And I was fortunate enough very lucky to sit on the committee that was part of organising the statue of the Queen, to sort of commemorate her lifelong interest in the sport and her support of horse racing. And if I'm entirely honest, at the back of one's mind, you always sort of think, are we forcing this? Is it something that people really want? Will it be something that people just think, oh, well, okay, so that's that. And I thought it was really gratifying, actually, to see how it became the focus of people's sort of commemoration and wanting to lay flowers at it and record their appreciation for the late Queen. And it was just a personal sort of satisfaction at that moment to think, I think again, just as the museum is an extraordinary legacy, I thought what was very touching was to see how the statue up near the racecourse had become a focus for people's wish to mark the passing of such an extraordinary person.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. Thank you again for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion to recall the day when Queen Elizabeth II visited Newmarket, Suffolk, the National Horse Racing Museum, on Thursday, the 3rd of November, 2016.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for asking me. It's been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Paddock and the Pavilion. You can download the show on Apple Podcasts,
Amazon Music,
SoundCloud, Stitcher and Spotify.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at The Pad and Pav. Don't forget, if you like the show, please do leave us a rating and review.
Sports Social Podcast Network.